1, live, please. Well, welcome back to the last session of the MAS Red Group conference, and I'm sure you'd all agree that we've had a really interesting start to the day, headed up by Sarah and her keynote speech, for which many thanks, and then a look into the world of CKIT, a really interesting overview from the Far East with Quangle, and then a look at the defence world. And finally, before we broke for a short pause, Stuart Ratcliffe from Thales. Now we're going to change the emphasis, and I'm delighted to welcome Britt Pickering to take centre stage. Britt is the Claims and Legal Director for Ship Owners, one of the organisations that has been at the absolute van of pushing this. But what she's going to talk about, which is something we've already heard mentioned several times, is that wonderful link between risk and insurance. So Britt, the floor is yours. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes, perfect. Thank you very much. I am so happy to be invited to participate in this conference. And I'm going to speak about autonomy, risk and insurance. This is such an exciting sector. So could I have the next slide, please? Thank you very much. I won't dwell on this slide. It's not a sales pitch, but I thought it might be relevant just to explain for a moment a few things about Ship Owners Club before I get into the body of the presentation. This is because I'm going to use some Ship Owners Club statistics, and so it's good that you have a little bit of background. So Ship Owners, we are a P&I club, and P&I stands for protection and indemnity, and what we do is we provide third-party liability insurance for vessel owners and operators, and typically you're looking at risks like so core risk, crew injury, illness, death, collisions, pollution, cargo loss and damage, also damage to fixed and floating objects like jetties, buoys, subsea structures and pipelines and cables, as well, of course, as wreck removal. Just picking a few things from the slide which I think are relevant. We've been going since 1855, so we're quite an old organisation. I haven't been there all that time, thankfully. And we've got over 32,000 small and specialist vessels entered in the club. We're a mutual, so our assureds essentially own the club, and we refer to them therefore as our members. One particular focus I'd like to say is that we are focused on small and specialist vessels, and here I just want to emphasize the word rather specialist. Because whilst I don't think in the medium term, or definitely in the long term, that mass sector will be considered specialist, I think for the moment at least it is. Thank you. Next slide, please. So I've given you a snapshot of the Ship Owners Club and our focus, but I think it's so important that we don't dwell too much on our history. We have to look to the future. And you can't read any of the marine press or the marine trade press now without seeing articles on mass. Sometimes, though, I think that they're written as projections into the future, and they do often rather ignore the fact that the sector has made huge strides and that these vessels are actually operating now. They exist now and they're working now in the field. As a club for small and specialist vessels, one of the most important quotes for me, at least, relates to moving against the trend. And what I mean specifically here is larger fleets of smaller vessels. This is obviously a particular opportunity for us as insurers. But of course, to take advantage of this opportunity that this sector brings, it's important that we as insurers, all insurers, understand fully the needs of the mass sector, what owners and operators in this sector actually really want, and the challenges that they face. Aligned to this, we must also assess the risk profile that the sector presents. We must really understand that. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Before we specifically consider mass in a risk context, I thought I'd just take a minute to look at some traditional shipping risks. And this slide illustrates claims experience at our club, and in relation to frequency alone, and also in relation to traditional vessels, manned vessels, and traditional P&I covers. When you look at this slide, I have to just remind you first that we have over 32,000 vessels entered, so there's a lot of data in there. You can see the pie chart that our claims experience by claim type is dominated by crew claims. Illness, injury, death. These are the claims that make up by far the most significant type of claim by frequency, not by quantum, but definitely by frequency. So if I just put some real numbers on that, for 2020, we were notified of just under 3,000 claims. And of these claims, around about 40% are crew claims. And that equates to around about $17 million US. Now, $17 million US for one insurer, for one sector of claims is a lot. And I think it's important to stress that. But what's really important to stress, and to not pass on over rather, is an acknowledgement that behind each crew claim, there is pain, suffering and hardship for the crew member and his or her family. So this is just a snapshot of our claims experience. I do hope though that it really assists in putting crew claims into some kind of perspective. We are, of course, just one insurer. We're one of 13 main P&I mutual shipping insurers. There are many more out there. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. We've heard the dreaded word COVID a few times over yesterday and today, and I thought it would be remiss of me not to touch on COVID now when I'm talking about crew. Last year, of course, we saw the emergence of a new claim type as a result of the pandemic. This slide here shows a snapshot of 2020 again. And you can see there that, well, if you can add up very quickly, we opened just under 300 files, COVID files, with an incurred value at the end of last year at 5.5 million or thereabouts. Those numbers have gone up in January, and the quantum has significantly gone up. It's quite sobering, and it's very sobering as well when we look at our granular data in the club, and we subdivide by jurisdiction, because you can actually see the virus moving around the world as claims spike in various areas. Of course, as COVID slowed shipping in general, we saw declining numbers in our other claims, so collisions and pollutions and wreck removal. So there was a balance there. I referred a moment ago to the COVID risk as a new risk. Obviously, it's not really new. Our traditional risk have always covered quarantine expenses, but never quite on this scale before. Also, I think it's true to say that whilst COVID has affected all workplaces, I think that seafarers themselves have suffered really, really harsh effects. It's been particularly acute for them. Accessing medical assistance, repatriation of sick, injured, ill crew, and even repatriating bodies of crew has been so difficult and time consuming. And that is, of course, aside from the operational effects that ship owners and managers have suffered as they've been unable to conduct crew changes in a timely manner. Could I have the next slide, please? Moving away now from injury and illness, just for a moment, I've attempted on this slide to delve a little deeper into the root cause of all claims, to illustrate the effect of human error or the human element plays. When we think of crew as P&I insurers, various separate but connected issues spring to mind. We've already discussed injury, illness and death suffered by crew members, but we've also got to think about human error on the part of crew, leading to P&I incidents like collision, like pollution. I'll come back to that point in a moment later. So as vessels evolve and manning levels reduce, what's this going to mean for risk and our assessment of risk? Of course, one of the obvious and direct implications is that illness, injury and death claims suffered by crew on board vessels will reduce in line with reduced manning. In the MASS environment, we now see that crew will remotely work. And I was very struck yesterday by the images that Dan Hook showed us of the remote onshore operations centre envisaged in Southampton. It is this remote operation and control that represents a fundamental departure from our traditional understanding of crew risk. And obviously for MASS, some crew may seldom, if ever, board a vessel. They're unlikely to be signed on any one vessel in the usual way, and they're unlikely to be working under the same standard employment contract, rather, that we are very used to working with. Can we, though, as marine insurers, feel confidence in provision of cover to these shore-based crew? Well, it's interesting because, as you saw earlier, crew claims of this type account for such a high frequency of claims that we incur. What is clear, though, I think for me at least, is by removing the often harsh and remote on-board environment, the crew risk is definitely lowered. I alluded earlier to the fact that it's not quite as simple as that, because it's not quite as simple as crew themselves having a claim, sustaining an injury, suffering an illness, because crew members are additionally implicated in the causation of non-crew related claims. And you can see there from that pie chart that human error is implicated in over half of all P&I claims. Now, there's a massive caveat here, which I would be remiss if I didn't mention, and that is, of course, crew often avert incidents and they often mitigate incidents. And we as insurers, we don't always hear about that. We hear of the claims and the bad times rather than the near misses. Seafarer intervention is key in many ways. So the club covers liabilities such as damage to property, collision, pollution caused by crew error. With MASS, how will the reduction of onboard crew affect the risk of, say, a collision or pollution incident? It's a very, very wide question. Yesterday's speakers and today's actually focused on some critical areas: reliability of communication, ship to shore, and of course, cyber implications. Next slide, please. So the last three slides hopefully have given you a snapshot of claims, crew claims, including COVID, and also into causation in a very general sense. Moving now to insurance of MASS itself. In our club, we've had a suite of plain language policies since 2011, and they cover vessel sectors like yachts, passenger vessels, fishing vessels, and inland craft, of course. And they've been very popular, and the language is tailored to the unique requirements of each vessel type. As James very nicely said, we've had a very early interest in MASS in the club, and that interest led us to seize the opportunity early on to develop our own plain language policy for MASS vessels, and that's MASS operating in the small and specialist market. All the P&I covers, which you'll remember do include collision, crew, cargo, etc., are all there. However, for MASS, we recognise that this is an evolving sector, and we're always keen to explore with our members, our mass members, how we can widen our covers on an individual basis to suit the exact requirements of any particular member. This for us is definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach, and understanding the risk can be quite an intensive process as we work with members to ensure that we give them exactly what they need to operate. There's often a gulf between what we think somebody wants and what they actually want and what they actually need. So we take time to make sure that we understand that each time. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I think maybe go back one. That's it. That's perfect. Thank you. I think we skipped one then by mistake, and we skipped the one with the code on it, which is not appropriate at all. So challenges for insurers here. There are some particular challenges in understanding the mass risk, in particular the quality of tonnage and also operational standards. For example, in a traditional risk context, when underwriting a fully manned vessel, insurers are of course really interested in flag and class because they indicate qualities. They're very good indicators of quality. This slide notes registration, and by this I mean, of course, the formal process of establishing a link between the flag and the vessel flying its flag in order to exercise jurisdiction and control over that ship. Of course, registration on its own is not interesting to us at all as insurers if it just simply represents a piece of paper. It's the underlying process of registration that encompasses safety, manning, fitness of purpose. That's where we derive some comfort in a traditional risk placement. Currently, though, we don't require registration of mass in order to provide insurance. As I mentioned, for the time being, we are treating each individual risk on its own basis. Turning for a moment to class and class societies, obviously they govern the standards for the construction of vessels. They supervise construction in accordance with those standards, and also they carry out obviously the regular surveys to ensure ongoing compliance with standards. Classification is not mandatory, and it may not be appropriate for some domestically trading tonnage, mass or not. The mass we insure are at the moment currently, for the most part, not classed. In the next slide, I touch a little on the tailored nature of underwriting a mass risk. But before I do so, I just wanted to focus for a moment on the last bullet point on this slide. As a mutual insurer, it's our role to support our members. When one of our members has a claim, we work with them to establish whatever defences we can, and the defences that we believe are available under whatever convention and regulation stands. If there's uncertainty as to whether a mass can fit in with some of the existing legislation, we simply work with what we have to achieve the best outcome for our members. We cannot have too much rigidity at this stage in the sector, we don't think. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. We have developed our own individualised underwriting approach for mass because we recognise that it's a little bit more complex at the moment than underwriting a traditional risk. We're not always able to rely on the parameters of class and also of registration, and the legal and regulatory framework as well is not always in place. Of course, when assessing a traditional risk as well, we're able to fall back on a huge body of data of past claims that we've had over the years. And for mass, this data is relevant to some extent, but it's not exactly on point. You can see there from the slide the various checklist points that it's very mass specific. And of importance to us here is compliance with the voluntary code. This is particularly helpful for us at this stage of insurance, as we consider that it's a best practice guide. And it covers in its 10 sections everything from cyber to training, and it seems to be everything else in between as well. So it's pivotal for us. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. This leads me on now to think a little bit more about opportunities and challenges. Neil Tinmouth from CKIT spoke about aligned technology in an operational context. He was talking about wind farms. I found that was very interesting personally. In an insurance context, we are particularly excited to explore the concept of aligned technology. It's very exciting that prospect of collecting ship data in real time. It could possibly enable some kind of pay-as-you-go insurance solution, as we as insurers could understand real-time risk, what the vessel is doing, where exactly she is, what's led to an incident, etc. Obviously, evidence gathering is critical when there's a claim, and as the claims and legal director of the club, the opportunity to obtain accurate real-time evidence from mass is incredibly compelling. There has been and continues to be considerable focus on mass from a cyber risk perspective. And from a purely P&I angle, cyber risks do concern us because if, for example, an autonomous system is compromised in some way, could lead to collision, property damage, all manner of other incidents, which could technically fall within club cover. We do look at cybersecurity when it comes to assessing risk. We look at the code, the risk management matrix, etc. I fully agree with the speakers yesterday. A clear cyber plan is needed, and that is from design to operation. I particularly endorse the nettitude comment that it's not just a matter of compliance. It's not a tick box exercise. It's about a mass owner and operator really understanding the cyber risk and demonstrating that there are systems and protocols in place to avoid the risk. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention the environment just for a second here, greenhouse gases and emissions. For me, mass is a new sector. These vessels are being designed and they're being built, I think, to harness clean energy and align with, for example, the IMO's commitment to cut greenhouse emissions. We at the club are very encouraged to see that many of the mass vessels that we have entered and that we see are harnessing different energy sources. This is part of an expanding and very powerful corporate responsibility agenda that's becoming so more prominent for companies going forward. Could I have the next slide, please? So a few closing thoughts. The ability for us as insurers to adapt hinges on the ability for us to recognise a shift in risk. To do that, we must make sure that we at every single opportunity engage with industry and really ensure that our interests are aligned and that we understand exactly what is needed from us. Sarah Kenny's keynote speech this morning was very insightful. A key takeaway of her presentation for me was trust and risk, the ability to trust and the ability to take a risk, not a crazy risk, but an educated risk. The mass sector is forging ahead, and the support sector, and that's where insurance lies, must step up and must support. Next slide, please. Thank you. So that's the end of my presentation. I've ended it with a very traditional vessel pictured. This is a fishing vessel, and I think I put it there because it represents to me a sector which is particularly demanding of its crew. So thank you so much for your attention. Happy to discuss any questions now or wait for the panel later if that's more appropriate. Thank you.
Britt, thank you very much indeed. To pick up on your last point, we will wait till the panel so that we don't run too far behind in timings. Okay. I'll be publishing 3 questions for that panel which have come in, and you'll be able to see those as I publish them in a moment. But from all of us, thank you. It means an enormous amount to all of us involved to know that the insurance world and ship owners in particular are being so forward-thinking in their support for what we're doing. Without it, it would be much, much more difficult. So thank you. We're now going to move on in our speakers to look at the combined opportunities that autonomy offers for both short sea shipping and inland waterways. And I can't think of a better person to do this than Antoon van Coillie, Director of Zulu Associates. So Anthony, over to you, and we look forward to your presentation.
There you are. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Thanks for having me on the conference, and I will talk about the opportunities we see for indeed autonomous vessels. Could I have the next slide, please? We Zulu Associates are active as we say, an initiator, developer, and operator of innovations in what we call the marine component of logistic chains. And we want to build zero-emission vessels, and we do that through autonomous operation and what we call alternative propulsion. Next slide, please. We believe that we have to go to zero emission because why? Simply there's a quite a large issue, an important issue on sustainability. We are really in a crisis for the world, we think, and there's a sense of urgency where we need to take urgent action to combat climate change. And there are a number of things that needs to be done. We don't have a solution for everything, but I think if little by little solutions things are happening, then as we say, Salome's solution, we can get there. And we believe that zero emission shipping is one of the elements of that. Next slide, please. Again, if we see our neck of the woods here, specifically in Europe, and you can see my slide on the Rotterdam, Dover and Antwerp area, the CO2 emissions are quite extensive, especially also with short sea shipping. And of course, the IMO has now made a timetable to reduce the GHG emissions, but we believe 2050 is too far off. And indeed, we have clients today who are in touch with us, who are actually asking us, can you get vessels before 2030 on zero emission? Next slide, please. We've done obviously the economic analysis, and we find that autonomous operations enable major cost savings. First of all, the lowering of the cost of the crew, and we're not just talking about salaries, but also all the safety equipment, the hospitality function or hotel function on the vessels, the accommodation, the galleys, all that sort of stuff is one thing. And of course, as Britt just was saying, we believe that insurance costs will go down because one of the first things is that there's nobody on board the vessel. And of course also the reduction of human error. It will also lower the energy costs, not only by route planning, but in effect, if you don't have people on board, then you don't need energy to keep them warm, keep them fed, and give them light. So that's another element where we have lower energy needs. So that means actually that we can make smaller vessels competitive with larger manned vessels. And this opens the door to use more sustainable propulsion systems and does reach increased sustainability, because indeed the systems to make low to zero emission propulsion are today already available on reduced scale, i.e. for small vessels. Next slide, please. Hello, next slide. There we are. First of all, What do we mean by autonomous vessels? There are a number of things going around. In our definition of autonomous vessels, it allows the vessel to have autonomous operation equipment on the vessel for the existing waterway infrastructure, so that means that we don't expect new infrastructure to do so. Obviously, no crew on vessel during passage or transit. As soon as you have one person on board, then the economic model doesn't work. We do use remote control centers for continuous contact of the vessel monitoring and control. The autonomous equipment should be capable of situational awareness and complexity analysis, and therefore the situational awareness should be able to be communicated from the vessel to the RCC. And the RCC can intervene in steps depending on the operational situation and the needs. It can go to another place, or I take over full control of the vessel. And of course, we need a fallback safety action as well. And last but not least, we are firm believers in data gathering, not only for the vessel itself, but to give that data also, to provide that data to other vessels and other users, so that we can really have a very good view of what's happening. Next slide, please. So if you look at the economics of autonomous operation, on the one hand, we have, if we talk about a new vessel, a lower investment because we don't have the accommodation, we don't have a number of safety systems specifically for crew. But on the other hand, we will have some higher investment. We have onboard artificial intelligence, we will have sensors, we'll also have to put in redundancy because if certain systems break down, there's nobody to repair it on the vessel, therefore you need redundancy. Good communication, and of course we have to invest in an RCC. On the OPEX side, we have no crew costs or no wages, personal equipment, catering, safety equipment, all that can go. Lower energy needs, as I said, increased safety, and of course more efficient voyage planning. On the higher costs, we have the RCC, which is also going to give a cost. We'll need some additional equipment, maintenance of that equipment, and additional import support. The vessel will come in port and will obviously have to be catered for. The handling of loading, unloading will be done by people in the port, no longer the people from the vessel. And of course, we have some higher communication costs. But all of that in our calculations means that we make a margin for increased competitiveness versus crewed vessels. And that means we can also look at alternative propulsion. Next slide, please. When we talk about propulsion, we are using electric engines for our vessels and to use a modular containerized system for providing the power generation on the vessel, which means that we won't have any traditional bunkering anymore, but we will be using a replacement for maintenance, but also replacement for the bunkering by using other containers where the energy is in. So we have a very modular system that also will allow transition from one system to another as we get more performance zero emission propulsion systems. And of course, what is interesting, such a modular system can be provided by third parties, such as energy utilities, that obviously will then sell the energy on a as you use basis and not as an investment. We obviously will need shore power, and indeed we are also looking, as Britt was explaining, to other means of propelling the vessels, i.e. wind and force, whenever it was possible. Next slide, please. Because of all of that, what we found is that retrofitting or updating existing vessels to be autonomous and sustainable is economically and actually technically not really viable. The cost involved in creating a digital twin for autonomous operation, if you have each vessel is another vessel, then you have to create a new digital twin each time. But if you make new vessels and you standardize them, you only need to do that once. So retrofits, as I said, need always to be made to measure, and if you do it standardized with new vessels, this is not the case. We also see that the hulls of vessels today are really optimized for efficient propulsion. So there is a need for new types of vessels, new hulls. And of course, in existing vessels, you will have unused crew accommodation, which you don't need, and it still will be on the vessel. So we basically have decided not to go for retrofitting for our services, but create two new vessels, one for short sea, the Zulu Mars, and the X-Barge for inland waterways. Next slide, please. So we have set up a company called Anglo-Belgian Shipping Company, which will be providing short sea vessel services with autonomous vessels in the near future. Next slide, please. We are designing a 2,500 ton, 180 container marine autonomous surface ship system, which is actually a short sea platform for container flows on the short sea and even what we call river sea on the continent. It will be a standardized and assembly line production vessel, very modular in equipment, not only to allow ease of maintenance, but also to allow technical true life maintenance and upgrading. We'll have a modular and exchangeable energy provision systems, a new hull design and routing also, digitally connected and also cradle to cradle. Next slide, please. The segments we're looking at with this vessel are the river sea market segment flows. This is today a segment which is quite important in Europe and where we see a lot of opportunities. And instead of going for ro-ro, we go for the lo-lo, which will result in shorter transits on land, direct connections into inland waterways, less road freight used, and therefore also less congestion on roads, which is a huge issue in the European context and also in the UK. The replacement market segment is replacing the existing vessels of the coastal segment. We know from studies by DNV that there are about 10,000 vessels and the age of half of them is more than 30 years. And these vessels will be difficult to become sustainable, therefore they will need to be replaced. So we're talking about a market size probably of about 2,000 new vessels in the next 10 to 15 years. Next slide, please. Hello, next slide. Oh, there you are. So again, this is the vessel which is being designed. It's got an overall length of 95 meters, a draft 5.5, a beam of 15, and it will run at about 10.5 to 11 knots and will carry 180 TEU, and actually will be designed more to carry the 45-foot containers. Why? Because the 45-foot container is the alternative to truck, top liner trucks. And therefore, that's the replacement market which we want to go for. Next slide, please. As I said, the market segment is estimated about 2,000 units. We think they will need to become operational in 10-15 years. There's also the Green Deal initiative from Europe, which is pushing very hard for that. We also have to see that no single shipyard is capable to fulfill this production, so it will be an interesting exercise to see who could be involved in the building of that. But anyway, we'll go from maximum standardization and, if possible, assembly line production. This means that we could easily make them competitively in Europe, and we don't have to go to Asia and so on to build these vessels. We look for cost savings through standardization and quantities, and as I said, we will be cooperating with a number of existing shipyards to do so. Next slide, please. Then we talk about the inland navigation company, Zinc. Therefore, we got the zinc symbol for the X barge. Can we go to the next slide, please? This is a new vessel as well. It's a 1,500 ton, 80 container inland barge. This is the size which is most uniform for most waterways in Europe. Again, standardized assembly production. It's modular in equipment. It's the same setup as with the Zulu Mars. Because we don't like silos, we want to move technology from one side to the other to the two types of vessels. Modular design, exchangeable energy provision systems, again, a totally new hull. We find, especially in inland waterways, that the hulls which have a high block coefficient are very inefficient. And making big vessels in canals make the canals actually narrow waters. And the need for energy for a vessel in a narrow water can go up to 60, 70, 80% of its energy needs in open waters. So having big vessels in small canals actually is increasing the emission problem instead of reducing it. Therefore, we think we need efficient hulls that move easily in also small canals. Next slide, please. Again, replacement market. Well, there are about 10,000 vessels running around on inland waterways, even a bit more when I'm talking about Western Europe. Most of the ships are outdated. High tech today still means having Euro Stage 2 diesels. which are actually less sustainable than a Euro Stage 6 diesel truck. Most of these vessels are on average 44 years old, so there is really a need again for replacement. And we're talking again 2,000 plus type of vessels. And to give you this context, if we were to build 2,000 new vessels in the next 15 years, that basically means we have to build one vessel every 2 days if we start today. So we have a huge amount of work to be done. Next slide, please. There you are, the big lines. It's an 85-meter long, but it only has a 2.5-meter draft, which will also allow it to run on the River Rhine at low tides or at low water levels. Service knots is about service speed is about 8 knots, and it will carry 80 TEUs. Sometimes could be more if we vary the air draft and can do so. Next slide. Again, as I said, market segment, time frame 10 to 15 years because of the Green Deal initiative. And we basically have the same scenario as the Zulu Mars, only we fit it down to the inland waterways. Next slide. There you are. Thank you very much for listening to me and giving me the opportunity to talk about this. We are very keen to go ahead. We are in the fundraising at the moment, and we are also talking to clients who are actively discussing with us the chartering of the autonomous vessels. And we are talking about being operational end of 22, beginning of 23. This is the timeline we want to hold out. Thank you for listening to me. Bye-bye.
Anthony, thank you very much indeed. I've published a couple of questions which will largely be reflected within the panel session. So I think what we'll do is we'll move straight into the final, some would say most important presentation of the day from Tony Boylen, and then we'll have a little bit more time to expand on the panel when all our speakers will be available, and this will be chaired by Ben Murray, who is the Director of Maritime UK. So if we're ready to rock, I can't actually see Tony Boylen at the moment, but there we are. Tony, the floor is yours, and we're looking forward to hearing what you say. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Unfortunately, I can't maintain my camera feed. If I put it on, I start buffering at the critical moment. I think I'll drop the line. So perhaps that refers back to some of the technology sort of points we raised earlier in the conference. So yeah, my name's Tony Boylen. I'm the Principal Specialist for the Assurance of Autonomy at Lloyd's Register. I just at this moment want to thank James, not just for this conference and many that have gone before, but the years of work that have gone into building this, and each year goes by and adds more and more value. It was interesting to be the last presenter. Obviously some things get sort of said, so I'll try and cut out repetition where I can, and a little bit will be on the fly, so I apologise if anything does come across as so. It's further interesting of following on the defence sort of work. In essence, that was my background. I started autonomy in 2005 in the Ministry of Defence, where for 12 years I was the underwater desk who was tasked with conceptualisation of what was the future of mine countermeasures, which has grown into the MHC programme. And up till 2017, in essence, I led all of the demonstrations and delivery to the Maritime Autonomous Trials team, including the Royal Naval boat Hazard, which was the sole boat delivered to the Royal Navy in that financial year. So it does bring some back positive memories. The reason I say that is I think it helps to contextualise. I and other members of our team fully appreciate from the very start innovative, small, to the very, very big that will come in this presentation. We cover the full spectrum and understand where all stakeholders fit in and their different needs at different times. And hopefully that sort of message comes across. I'll try and avoid going too deeply into the cyber. Ben Densham of Netitude is obviously part of Lloyd's, and we collaborate strongly on that. So there's obviously support. So next slide, please. So as I said, I'll try and keep this short, but these are sort of obviously the smaller certification end of the spectrum. A lot of these are sort of projects that we've delivered. A few we've only had some very light engagement on, but I wanted to show a fuller spectrum of what's out there. it brings back some memories. I remember meeting Dan Hook in Southampton when his start of this process was really as a spin out of the university, and yesterday we saw just how far he's come. Next page, please. So this is sort of more on the classification end of the spectrum, where I want to focus a little bit more, because I appreciate a lot of the market is and attendees are more in the certification and small boats, but this is sort of obviously where some of the challenges will lie in how we proceed as a sector. So this is one of the projects amongst several others, but NDAs don't always permit me to sort of talk sort of about these, but the limited information I can give on this one is that we were about 12 months in to a multi-year demonstration, and so far successfully we were managing to manage this, sort of deliver this through Singapore remotely, and albeit some very early teleconferences and stuff like that, but that sort of deliverable was going quite well. Just to put some context for those who can't sort of visit it, that vessel is 200 meters long, 37 meters in beam, and a gross tonnage of 75,000 tons. It's capable of carrying approximately 8,000 cars. The map shows its transit routes, and in essence, we are looking at autonomy for those routes and the demonstration of that. So that is where we are, and it's 12 months in. So hopefully, contextually, you understand that we do from the very small to the rather large. Okay, next slide, please. So this slide is the very high level of our unmanned systems code for certification. Quite a few people have been taken through it, as you can allude from a few slides back. This approach was adopted basically by LR to reflect issues with the rather rigid sort of manned standards that people and trying to apply it to a more agile market. As I believe it was Mike from BAE raised, sort of rigid rules are very prescriptive and define actions that can and cannot be engaged in. They're very precisely drafted and highly constraining, and sort of specifying how the regulations are actioned. So a goal-based rule system it has varying levels of specificity, basically generally allowing you sort of very high level, setting out broader principles, outcomes, and therefore the standards, and then it's the tiered effect that you can see on the page. And as I said, clearly this sort of is more applicable, especially when we're talking of the smaller certification level. If a customer comes to us and hasn't already established one, we start with developing a concept of operation or a ConOps, very common in the defence world, and we develop that through and it helps to begin the approach and formulate the structure thereafter. Next slide, please. So the goal base allows us to adapt basically to each customer need, and all of you are unique and bespoke in the way you approach it. Even those who appear to be very common in technology solutions are always on a slightly different page, different place, different approach, different exploitation. So the ability to be flexible to your needs and address them helps us package your work and obviously demonstrate to all parties that need to see the evidence that it's the sort of the benefit of where we are. So in essence, what we're striving to is the twin goals of the equivalence of safety and a LARP as low as reasonably practicable in risk, and that allows sort of different architectures to be demonstrated. If you were to look at a system where you have more advanced situational awareness but poor decision making, and then flip those over, you may have the same level of output. So it allows you to rather than having a very fixed rigid structure where you in essence would pass or fail, it's the factoring across the whole system. So it enables a holistic look at the system to identify where it performs. Next slide, please. So yeah, in essence, what this allows us to do is move away from the centric man standards and the archetypal sort of centric approach that delivers. The very simple message I want to convey is really that if it doesn't appear to fit your requirements, we can find a way to adjust it to fit your requirements. That's not to circumvent need, but there is always an agile way to meet your specific needs and requirements. Next slide, please. So I don't want to dwell on these particularly. I'm sure everyone in the audience is comfortable with levels of autonomy, and there's several different versions out there. You could argue much of a muchness, but they all have in essence a common meaning. And I just want to sort of indicate sort of different levels of performance, different levels of spectrum. Obviously, Dave drive different levels of assurance need. A lot of people are in the remote control. But where I want to focus some of the later comments is more as we go into sort of autonomy and full autonomy. Next slide, please. And again, these are just obviously the top end of the final state of full autonomy. Next slide, thank you. So, as I sort of, the setup for this is when we are at that full autonomy level, do those levels actually address our needs? Do they reflect how we want to perform? Now, in certification under the spectrum, I think, should we say, slightly more rigid, although we use gold base, but that rigid 1 to 6, as we alluded there, is more applicable or easy to use. As you go up the scale to the fully autonomous larger platform, what does that do for us? Is it where we want to be, and is it as agile and flexible as we need to be? So that's just a question I'd like to throw out there. I appreciate yesterday it was L3 Harris, I believe, that raised the automotive approach. There are definitely some approaches within automotive we should explore and look to bring across into our sector. However, I think it's very important to reflect there are several shortcomings in their approach, where they in essence have boxed themselves in, and certain countries are actually stepping back 2-3 steps to then go forward again, and potentially there's several years of knots to untangle before they can carry on down their path. So it's not quite as simple as saying there's lots of money being thrown at it from a different domain. It's understanding the good, the bad, and the indifferent, and which bits we should and shouldn't use from those. So historically, the traditional approach of ship classification rules provide for structural strength, the safety and reliability of propulsion, steering, and the effectiveness of other essential systems. These roles work together with statutory regulations with proper care and conduct of the crew and ship owners and operators towards the goal of a safe and sustainable operating and secure shipping. But what happens if the equivalent, what happens in equivalence when these are not measurable, as we often find in unmanned systems? Who actually defines a LARP? And which part of the system, if we do a shore-based and at sea, obviously, platform operation, who deconflicts the issues? What do we take to sort of as the risk for these novel systems? But I mean, it's a full system. If we go to the end of full autonomy, and I know Anthony alluded to that, there are times when the fully autonomous vessel will truly be fully autonomous and fully unmanned. But there is clearly the opportunity to have fully autonomous manned platforms where there is a crew under, not necessarily working to directly support the ship, but that might be cargo centric. It could even be paying passengers, and it's the nuanced difference of what that means. So we must consider that. There will always be a human-centric element to this, and it's important for us to understand and define the boundaries, the strengths and weaknesses, and the safety, obviously, implications of that. So we all recognise that the regulation is not quite available yet, and we have to holistically as a sector work towards that and identify and challenge the challenges, so to speak, of certification. Next slide, please. So this is just a very quick slide I almost want to just skip over. It's briefly just saying that these are just a few. There are several other sort of reference documents out there that people can go and seek and find advice and guidance from. I've highlighted the February 17 there for our code from our systems, just to indicate that in year there is a refresh of that. So those who are engaging us or wish to engage us, just to be aware that that is going on under. Obviously, my marketing team would crucify me if I said too much on that matter, but there is work underway, and that will come out in due course this year. Next slide, please. So there's a couple of purposes for this slide, perhaps three, if you include being mischieviously or childish, however you want to term it. But I think it is highly relevant. It goes back to the comment I made previously. I want to stimulate the thought that we do need the technology to provide the equivalence in lookout, but there is the potential to have the human underneath stroke in the vessel, and it's critical we do that. Excuse me. So the Convention of Prevention of Collision at Sea requires all vessels to have a proper lookout. I think we all register that. But what is that equivalence? And what is it in different environmental conditions? In essence, that is the equivalence. So several different, I'm just trying to circumvent some of the things that have been sort of talked over in previous presentation, sorry. I think as I'll just sort of skip the bit that's been covered elsewhere. I'll go back to the human autonomy relationship is becoming more and more relevant. It's critical that we do that as we put the life of individuals under the control of autonomy. The assurance and safety becomes more and more critical. We have confidence in the human and the training and all those processes. There are hundreds of years that have got us clearly in the shipping world. We are now talking about a relatively compressed time frame, and it's that confidence window and trust that other sort of presenters have talked about that are going to be critical to us. So as the ship design and technology change, other challenges we need to develop will be competencies, skill-based, sectoral approach, and I think the Minister even addressed that in the opening speech yesterday. But I think the best way, and to be brutal, the only way we'll succeed in doing this if it's a collaborative approach across the whole sector. We all have our strengths, we all have our gaps in knowledge or ability to exploit. If we work holistically and get the sector to it, and then people can start positioning themselves for opportunity, there's a real chance for us. It's if we inwardly maneuver against each other early, like a football team, it becomes very weak very, very quickly. Next slide, please. So as a representative of class, the burden of verification falls obviously very strongly on our shoulders. It's something we're addressing and we're clearly challenging and having strategies to push forward to. Perhaps when I took this job a year and a half ago and realising the assurance of autonomy was to be my job title, I recognised the connotations of that and the implications of that, of obviously not proving a system as safe if it were to be exploited in whichever domain it goes to. So in the absence of historical information, we must determine robust and acceptable ways of doing what we also see as cost-effective and repeatable and effective margins of error, safety margins of error. Does the autonomous vessel system behave as expected? Does it not do what it is not supposed to do? And grammatically, that's very poor. For any foreigners, I apologise, but I mean it in the not term. We have to. It's not proving it's safe. It's proving it's not unsafe. So it's that conflict of checking both ends of the telescope and fully understanding the system. Does it behave as expected? Or does that change when adverse weather conditions, etc., are impacting the system performance? We must establish confidence, and in turn, that will build the trust. Next slide. So again, this is a broad one, and this can polarize groups. It can polarize individuals. You can go from one conversation and half an hour later, an individual take a slightly different view. If we take a system, whatever that system may be, it may be maritime, wherever we go, and infer it has 1 million elements, whether that be widgets, blocks, lines of code, whatever you may term. If your system is 99.99% capable and of appropriate standard, most of us would immediately say that is of high value. But when you have 1 million lines of whatever, that's 100 errors. Are those 100 errors critical? How do we find if they're critical or not? How do we define what is the acceptable failure rate of that system? What method do we use to assess that? What level of risk, in essence, are we prepared to take? And most importantly, is how are we going to take the public with us through that process? Wherever we set that bar, and holistically we need to set that bar, but how are we going to take the public? Because a lot of these systems will be operating almost without any overt impact on them. But the current world, we cannot do systems and just push them through anymore. Those days and that approach have clearly changed. Next slide, please. So again, this is me just trying to, as the last presenter, to try and keep a little bit of attention and perhaps a little bit of humour in the thing. So this is just a simple canoeing exercise, reflecting OEMs and deliverers out there of technology. You are obviously intrinsically designing systems that avoid the other vessels around you. Everyone gets that. That's the critical part of autonomous navigation. Next slide, please. However, what happens when the environment changes? Where was that requirement set? And has there been a mission creep? And that might not be from the OEM, the supplier, that might be the customer. But when that environment changes, can we still demonstrate what was a safe system is operating safely now? Can that be proven or otherwise? That's the question we must look at. And again, I sort of suggest this is where class come from, the other end of the telescope. We do look both ways. We ensure that we understand it from your end, but we also have to look at it from the other. Next slide, please. So again, this is just sort of extrapolating performance in the environment. The sensor characterization and degradation of sensor performance are critical too. When we're operating in the small end of class certified vessels, not necessarily quite so important. Obviously, the risks of operation and how you're operating, and to be honest, a lot of systems obviously won't be pushed out in this type of condition. But when we go up to what I was talking here of the later end of full autonomy and larger vessels, when they are going to be operating these, what happens when we hit probably a typhoon, but is the rain in that? Does the sensor work? Is it predicting that we have rain from the sensor right through to the target? Is that rain in the near field? Is it in the far field? What does that do to the sensor performance? How is the degradation recorded? Do we actually understand what that means? If I was to pose a question to the audience and say, who has a full understanding of how their sensor performs and the levels of degradation throughout an environmental condition beyond what they read on the spec list from the camera or sensor supplier, I think there'll be a small party who has a true understanding and a larger party that clearly doesn't. Now, as I go back to the certification end, that doesn't necessarily matter. But as we get more and more into the larger scale, and obviously the risk grows exponentially, we need to understand that thoroughly. Next slide, please. So Again, slightly humorous, but this does have a truly valid point rather than just being childish and mischievous. But I wish I hadn't put this on now. I have to step back because there will be those who will ping me in the next year, go, you put the wrong slide and you said the wrong thing. This is clearly from The Empire Strikes Back. And it's got a fantastic quote, so that's why I liked it. However, it's to reflect the earlier film of The New Hope, when the Falcon comes out of hyperdrive into an asteroid field, which is where the planet of Alderaan was obliterated and destroyed. And the principle of the message is really, it's not just about navigating the here and now where you are. It is understanding where you are going and where you get to. If you come out the equivalent of hyperdrive and you get into an asteroid field and you aren't aware that you have, there are safety implications. Obviously, the technology is a little bit different, but hopefully you get the analogy. And as I said, it is the holistic understanding. Different approaches sometimes are looking at very close field, and it is the broader the field, the broader the understanding of the system performance and the long-term safety, and including this arrival at port. Alderaan was the planet of the equivalent of a port. If it's not the condition you think it is it timely? Is it safe to arrive there, etc.? These are the conditions we must start thinking and finding holistic technology approaches to understand. Next slide, please. So at this point, I have deliberately skimmed across the surface. I didn't want to go to a deep dive because, as I'm sure you can appreciate in assurance, we can end up spending the whole conference in one single element of one single system. And that's obviously not the purpose of today. We do not have all the answers, but we are building knowledge and experience for mass. And we're understanding the complexity of technologies at the different level and different capabilities required to bring them holistically together. What I think is highly relevant is no single entity will challenge the class and certification issues. It will be a holistic approach. It will not just be software. It will not just be hardware. It will also be humans. And that's humans operating, and that's humans supporting, overriding, at-sea operation support, what happens when there's a failure, etc. All those elements holistically will come together. So as I alluded to earlier, it is an ecosystem, and I think we can benefit together. So I just sort of almost finish on the points of suggesting that if the technology is really is ready, but the flag, IMO, class regulators aren't, the system's not going to get certified. If the regulatory challenges are addressed, but the public do not accept them, it won't get exploited. If the technology is trialled but doesn't suit the needs of ports, operators, etc., it won't fulfil the overall requirement, and therefore, again, will not be exploited. If all these challenges don't meet the business case, it won't be exploited. If we don't address the necessary skills, the system, the designers won't be there, the support, the operators, the deliverers, the OEMs won't be there. We won't get to market to exploit. Next slide. So I mildly apologise for the odd stutter and stuff. I'm trying to circumvent where I recognise other people have said a few things. It's always hard to sort of sometimes follow. It's always easier to lead. Appreciate your time, and just say thank you very much, James, again for all the effort in putting this together.
Tony, thank you very much indeed. And there's a lot in there that you've covered. Amanda, can we go to the cover slide, please? Now, I'm just waiting for Ben Murray to come online, who's going to chair the panel discussion. I know he's around because he and I have been talking. Thanks, Amanda. But for now, rather than waste time, there were a couple of questions that I've published, which I'd just like to fire. Britt, if you're there, yes, you are. Could you just say a little about the relationship between certifying authorities, class societies, hull and machinery insurers and paddle clubs? We've just heard Tony talk about the class side. would you like to comment on that, please? You need to unmute, I'm afraid.
Oh, I'm so sorry about that. Yes, our rules traditionally are based on vessels having hull and machinery insurance and having class. However, we really understand that that masts are new, and we embrace that, and so we look to other areas. And I think Tony's presentation just now has rather answered a lot of that question, I think. Of course, the structure of the vessel can be classed, and the autonomous equipment can be certified. We also look to things like, well, not things like, very important workboat code certification. And also, as I've mentioned in my slides, we've established our own matrix of questions and points that we want to delve into. So yes, there is a relationship between all of those, but it's early days, isn't it?
It certainly is. Tony, do you want to put a class view on that question?
It's just very broad, isn't it? I think there's so many questions, and as I alluded to earlier, every system is totally unique. Then it becomes even more unique by the time you its operating environment. All those are factors on factors. So generically, we must start to unify and holistically come and approach the regulators and go through, and then that has impacts, obviously positive impacts up into the insurance and all the different ends of the spectrum. It is about uniformly coming together. As an assurer, what I need to look is the other end of the spectrum. Is I need to look at any system that comes at me, and someone talked yesterday about common language, for instance. Well, I need to be able to look at any language and define whether it is safe or not. I shouldn't be explicitly saying a common language. However, in simple terms, if someone speaks English to me, that's easy for me to sort of go back and engage on. If they speak sort of a foreign language to me, that's harder. But I still have to get there and still have to understand the inputs. So it's a very complex one to say, because it's much broader than a simple line answer.
Okay, thanks. The question under it is, Britt mentioned classification, but of course most non-defence masts, thus far being under 24 metres, are designed, built and operated to the MCA workboat code by MCA-approved certifying authorities. I think the point from Alan was, can you please encourage operator applicants for insurance to seek appropriate code certification? Britt, do you have
yeah, absolutely, very important, and I think it was mentioned yesterday as well that the workboat code will be amended shortly. I think, isn't it? It's on the cards. No, it's very important for us. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, and then Sean Pribble, dialing in from his bunker in Washington, has opened the Pandora's box, which is called vessels, vehicles, systems, ships, etc. Tony, do you want to comment about this? I think it's such a widely debated subject, but from a class point of view, vessels, ships, systems, vehicles, a view?
I said it is incredibly broad. You start talking about the potential deployment of ROVs from a USV, UAVs off a USV. There's obviously the military context on that, but the wind farm inspection and stuff like that. So it's conventionally we are surface focused around that system, but there is a point when the world has moved on and we have to look at the systems of systems operation, and therefore what that means and how to address that. There are boundaries where, for instance, an ROV operation is out with that, but there is a time and a path where I think we do holistically start need to bring them all together.
Okay, I think Anthony Crabb, are you online now?
Yes, good afternoon, James.
Oh, great. Do you have a view on that particular point within a defence environment? I know it's hotly debated, but what's your thought on this whole domain and terms and terminology and so on and so on? How have you approached that within the Royal Navy?
So it's something that is definitely taxing us, and we're working through with DMR and the Defence Maritime Regulator and the Naval Authority Group, still trying to pull together a full understanding, and they on our behalf are continuing to work with the MCA. So it's something we're taxing. I haven't got a simple answer yet, but we know we need to get to the bottom of it, and it's on our list to do so in the future.
Sorry, James, can I just come back on that?
Yeah.
Not against the point, but again, just so people understand the context. The vast majority of work ongoing is people considering the autonomous navigation. Not many are talking about the autonomous vessel, and there's a nuanced difference in the language, but it's distinct, and people need to recognise that. But when we also go further to start saying whether it be a UAV, an underwater vehicle, even potentially, but that sends a message to an autonomous vessel to task it or retask it, to make it change its decision. How have we sort of assured that safely? Do we know there's cyber? All those different elements. So it is a very complex web. Once you start considering the operation as a system operation rather than an entity operation, that is a much more complex beast.
Okay, thanks for that. Now, Ben Murray, are you online? I think you are.
Yes, James, can you hear me?
Yes, I certainly can, and so can lots of other people, hopefully. I'm going to duck out now because I'll hand over to Ben, the Director of Maritime UK, who's going to chair the panel session. Ben, for what it's worth, there's a question there from Phil Buckley with fewer people involved. That's pretty much where I've got to in the published questions, and I'll keep publishing questions as I get new ones. So if you'd like to take over, all yours, and I'll turn my microphone off.
Great, thanks very much, James. I've just, unfortunately, I'm not seeing those questions on my side chat. I've just got the meeting chat. But what I would like.
Can you not dial in the questions on the right side of the control panel in front of you?
I just see meeting chat, and then there's nothing there other than people having joined the meeting.
No, not the chat. You should be able to see the questions. Live event Q&A. Can you see those?
Aha, brilliant. Yes, I can see those. Fantastic. So wonderful.
So if you go to the one from Phil with fewer people involved, if you start there and then work down the list, I'll pump more in as we go. Okay.
Wonderful. I can't see the question you're talking about there, but I've got just in the meantime, whilst we get that sorted, I've got just a quick question for everybody to get the ball rolling, if I may, and we'll have a look at getting that sorted now. But to the panel, I've been able to dip in and out of questions and remarks earlier today. I think it's been a really fascinating session. Well, my first question to everybody really is that we have these conferences, and we hear a lot in the trade press and so on about the start of the year, about a year being an incredibly important year for this technology in particular, for automation in particular. I just wonder what, very quickly, if each panelist would be able to just set out what they think is the biggest and most significant development we're likely to see this year. And I think rather than talking about challenge, I think it's quite nice to reframe it as what's the most likely and positive development that we can see in this year, 2021. So if I just come along to each of the panelists that we've got here today, just to ask that question, that would be something I'd be particularly keen to hear. So if first off we could come to Britt. Britt, do you have any thoughts on that?
Actually, I think yes. I think that a big development this year will be just actually seeing more vessels in this sector starting to operate. I think that the public perception of the safety of these vessels, hopefully I haven't jinxed it now, but the public perception will increase. And I think it'll just be more, hopefully it will become more normal, more standard. And I think with that, it will just breed more and more. So yes, I think it's just that. I just think it's the frequency and the leaps that we've seen. And actually just looking or thinking back to some of the talks we've had, you know, Dan Hook yesterday with his operations, and Seekit today, and also Antoon rather. Yeah, huge development. So I think it's just profile. I think for me, that's going to be a key thing, increasing the profile.
And then I guess in that, when it becomes a norm and people come to expect it and understand it and accept it, I think there's when things become living, breathing realities, it's a bit of a game changer.
Absolutely. And I think I mentioned earlier in the trade press, we quite often see lots of articles and news about autonomous vessels, mass vehicles, whatever you want to call them. But it's often sort of phrased in a very, look what we're going to get in the future.
Yeah.
Look, this is coming online. This will be something interesting, you know, in the next God knows how long. But actually, they kind of forget that it's actually happening right now. And I think I'd like to see more acknowledgement of that. And I think that I will.
Great. No, thanks, Britt. Tony, your thoughts?
Only, I mean, it's to go along and almost validate that comment. I had a couple of quotes when I was given to me that always stuck with me almost throughout my career, and one of those was a very knowledgeable maritime sort of defence expert from industry, and he said to me one day, "Tony, what you have to remember is the further people run out in front, the more spears and arrows they shall get in their back." And I think what it means is, yes, you're right. So take Barnes Wallis, for instance, the bouncing bomb. He was a heretic who became a national hero once people went, actually, that's not a bad idea, and it seemed to work. Once people's mindset changes and you get closer because you are no longer out in front, and whichever part of the sector, and I mean this not as an individual to individuals, but to companies, to whoever, sometimes their world is very difficult and seemingly very painful. But if they stick at it and hold out, the world tends to catch them up, and then it normalizes. And then people don't raise the questions to say that wouldn't work, couldn't work, isn't safe. Have you evidence? We have to go through my side of the profession, the assurance, and make sure we meet that. But a lot of it is just stick at it, and it will come.
Can I just add another point as well? Just very sorry, I'm hogging it now, but I'll be quiet in a sec. But I sort of think as well that this year we've had and we're still having COVID and the huge reliance that we're having on technology. And I think this is a point that actually Sarah Kenny alluded to this morning in her keynote address. I think that there will be perhaps more acceptance because we all have moved on. We are all now using tech that we wouldn't have been using, and I think that will help.
Yeah, no, I think normalizing things, I think, it comes back to the culture and the context within which things are becoming prevalent, changes the norms and what people accept and expect and can work with. I think that's true, Britt. Well, thanks to Tony. Stuart, your thoughts about this year in particular? I think it's useful to think in that short to medium term. Obviously at the front line of this, doing this in an operational sense. What are your thoughts?
So as you mentioned there, and I think some of the others have talked about, I think it's a really interesting time that we are at, where we are seeing, and it's not just from Thales, but other companies as well, we are seeing these systems coming into actual operational use, and that's going to drive a huge amount of learning that comes out of it as we get that real world understanding about how these things are being used and how they are actually operating safely. And one aspect of that is the cognitive load on the operators. We conducted some quite major trials just at the back end of last year, and as we start to understand how the operators, how the human is actually engaged in this whole system, then I think we'll really make some important strides forward in terms of safe and effective operation, and start answering some questions about where do these capabilities really add value. So there are some where it's obvious that for safety, for example, they can really add value, but then there are some others that are a bit more speculative, where as has been talked about before, the business model doesn't quite stack up. So I think this year is going to be really interesting in terms of that maturing, understanding where the value really comes in from maritime autonomous systems.
Right, thanks. It's kind of like bedding in, maturing, progressing in those ways as well. No, I think that's well heard. I think obviously you're not limited to the defence world in what you can offer. But I think just bringing in Anthony, just thinking from a naval point of view, what's the likely change, development, leap forward going to be this year from your point of view?
So I think, like the other panel members there, we're going to see for the Navy an increase in numbers. The simple across the different autonomous projects, we're going to see numbers. Therefore, like Stuart has just said, we'll be able to put them into these operational footprints, and that's going to be the change as well. In that previously, a number of experimentation events have taken place where contractors delivered the autonomy through their vessels, and I don't want to sound dismissive or anything like that, but it's going to transfer from a science and technology project now into tangible operational environments. We're still going to be doing experimentation, but they're now going to be within tactical scenarios, and so that is going to unlock a lot of more learning. It'll feed back into how we now design the next iteration, and I think that's going to be exciting, because it's going to be some of the operators or that transition from a civilian contracted operator into a uniform operator, and that's what I see as being our big change this year.
That's really interesting. Thanks very much, Anthony. Mike, I can't see you. Are you here?
Yes, I am. So I think for me, this year really marks a change in funding. I think the technology and the sort of credibility of some of the solutions has turned a bit of a cornerstone. I think back just a few years, and people were putting demonstrators and things together on sort of shoestring type funds, and now we're starting to see some really mainstream adoption, some big budgets. And I think that really accelerates the way forward. And someone who's been working now in this area for about 5 years, been through that early and very painful part of the process, but feel pretty passionate about it. It's really nice to see it properly getting funded at last.
And are you seeing that, just to follow up if I may, are you seeing that more broadly from others beyond the sector? There's always I'm in a role where we're often, companies are wanting us to work to secure various pots of government funding and try and unlock that and match people together. Are you seeing that there's a step change? Others from what we might call traditionally outside the sector are seeing developments here and opportunities here more regularly, people getting in touch more often, and that translating into to more engagement and funding. Is that something that's happening, starting to?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's transitioned from being a little bit of a niche science project to the same revolution that driverless cars are seeing, which is people are bought into the dream. They can see the scale of it. Lots of people's presentations have been historically big numbers of how many trillions of pounds or how many millions of tons or how many billions of tons, and finally people can see the gap between actually the technology is on the verge of being there, and the business case does stack up. And bizarrely, I think a lot of us are finding that COVID could have been an economic disaster for our interests, and I don't think I've ever been so busy. And I know lots of people tell me exactly the same thing. We're all getting bored with doing Zoom calls in our pajamas and not going out and seeing anything. But actually, the opportunities haven't dried up at all. We should all be very glad we're not in hospitality.
Yeah, Absolutely. Well, it sounds like what we get, the impression we're getting from various speakers is that this is about to some extent, a tipping point in where developments are, where there's that perhaps cultural or yeah, I guess a cultural acceptance and support and backing for it, but also then broader interests, seeing this as a sector and as a part of the sector, technology within the sector that is likely to be viable in the way that it is already, but in a much quicker and I guess a more exciting way this year in particular. Just to finish for the two panelists we have here to talk about what we think this year might be, I guess a tipping point might be a way of framing it, or positive developments that might happen this year. Neil, if we can come to you and just give your thoughts.
I think mine is very much like everybody else on the panel. Being a commercial company and just delivered our first vessel, I think it's going to be seeing those operations in real life. I think we've all experienced over the last couple of years, it's quite difficult. Demonstrations are expensive. You limit your time on the water because of this expense. So actually getting the vessels out there for the durations, that's being able to identify potential challenges or new ideas that may come out of it, or how to do things better. With these commercial operations, we're expecting to get a lot of learning out of it. I would say on top of that, it was also we've seen a shift from industry focus. So when we started this a couple of years ago, there was the certain big spenders. I mean, you're looking at your oil and gas type of organizations that were very interested in driving this technology. The other sectors that were going to have same use or commercial use were a little bit more hesitant to get interested. And all of a sudden, towards the end of last year, we saw a lot of these companies that we'd been in conversations with that said, yes, we're interested, but not really yet. They're all of a sudden starting to come on board and say, yes, we'd actually start to like to see demonstrations of this, and they can start to see the real commercial use. So we're really going to see a lot of adoption, if not more trials, but also more commercialization. Okay, so that's a really exciting time for everybody here, but particularly those companies actually, getting kit in the water and seeing that develop over the years. So thank you. And just to round it off, Antoon, your thoughts on that same question this year in particular. What's the likely positive development that you can see?
Actually, I see two things. First of all, I think we'll see a increasing pace of change in regulations, or going towards a change of regulations. I mean, I know for certain that in Belgium, for example, there will be a royal decree coming out sometime in April, allowing autonomous vessel operations in Belgian territorial waters. I know it's not a big piece of water, but anyway, it's part of what is happening. And the way the CCNR is working on that as well. So I think we'll see a race basically on getting regulations and different countries, because the economic reality is there. And for us personally, we are very hopeful to sign the first charter contracts with clients that want to use these vessels. I think there will be these type of vessels will change the way logistics are working with traditional shippers and traditional shipping lines. That will change, and I think having those first contracts will be extra push for us to go ahead. Yeah.
Really interesting is in that interface between the technological development and the work that many people here have been involved with in terms of trying to shape the regulatory landscape, and the interface between that and it becoming operational and commercially viable. It certainly seems, I'm not involved in a day-to-day sense with the work that colleagues on the line do. I mean, I have an understanding and have a contextual role to play, but I think what I've been seeing certainly is that people are just getting on with this now, and they're deploying these technologies, and it's starting to become something that's living, breathing, and viable. And I think you've all set out ways in which that's going to be happening to a greater extent this year, which I think is incredibly exciting. I'm afraid I'm having difficulty seeing the questions that the wonderful people who've come to join us today have submitted, which I hope the question I asked there was useful for people, and it's certainly useful for me, and it was really useful to see the similarities and where different parts of the sector within this space diverge as well. But I'm afraid I'm going to have to probably ask James to compare the questions that are coming in, and if I find a way of seeing those questions that our attendees have submitted, I'll come back in. But James, I think I'm going to have to hand back to you.
Ben, okay. Sorry you're having so much trouble. Let me pick up on a couple here. Does the panel envisage vessels that have no crew but are populated by folk who are delivering the task, e.g. no mariners but a team of surveyors, for example? How do we define the standards required for such unsupported people? Is that beyond the scope of the people in Mass Regulatory Working Group? The answer to that is yes, but and is it more the territory of ILO and other international people organisations? I think this is quite an interesting topic, really. Mike, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I think, you know, if you think of a sort of a scale going from things that are definitely unmanned right through to things that are maybe unmanned passenger ferries, then this sits nicely in the middle. So if you've got an unmanned passenger ferry, that's in some ways a bit of a frightening prospect, because you've got children, you've got disabled people, you've got people who are going to panic if something goes wrong and haven't got necessarily the training. So there's a whole bunch of issues. But if you've got people who are competent in the maritime sector, but not necessarily ship's crew, it is a bit of a different question. And I can imagine that happening in a not unforeseeable future, because they've probably got survival at sea training. They've probably got an engineering type background. They certainly will have had, you know, some familiarization with the platform they might be on. And although their full-time job, say, may not be ship's crew, that it may be possible in the you know, the occurrence of an adverse situation to provide them with enough know-how and training to safely unfix the problem. So I think if you're ever going to get to the equivalent of what the air sector are trying to do, which is this sort of, you know, driverless air taxi, which just sounds like a death trap, that seems a more achievable solution than going to you know, literally a driverless or an uncrewed passenger ferry. But as soon as you get the lawyers involved and you start talking about, you know, well, what about the liability when something inevitably does go wrong, because, you know, in a future where this becomes, you know, operationally viable rather than a research demo, it is going to happen. And then what's going to happen in the court of law?
Stuart, can I switch to you and say, what have you been thinking about this subject?
So I think fundamentally it will come down to a safety type assessment. So if we are, probably depends how you define crew as well. So if there are people on board a vessel, then in order for that to actually go into operation, there'll need to be an assessment of what the safety risks are, and if that includes having appropriately trained people on board, which I'm sure it would, and the right level of safety equipment on board, which I'm sure it would, then that would cover it off. I mean, certainly we're seeing, it's not my sector, but we are seeing autonomous ferries being proposed in Scandinavian countries, I believe. So it is coming to reality. So yeah, I can see there being maybe not traditionally crewed vessels there, but there will still be people on board with safety equipment and processes in place to do so.
Okay, Neil, do you have any thoughts on this from a CKIP perspective?
I think if I just focus on our operations, because as Stuart and Mike said about these ferries and people, that those things are definitely happening out there. But from CKIT, although it may be a requirement in the short term, as we try to do more complex operations, survey operations or deployment of equipment, there may be people on board. I think it'll be very short-lived before those processes in their own right become automated and replaced with other types of sensors and deployment mechanisms. So I don't foresee it being a major challenge. And with the sector, with what we're working with at the moment, we're really focusing on this purely uncrewed technology. So we would probably be stepping away from having people on board, unless it was in a demonstration where you have a guard vessel and you probably have somebody who's there to take control of the vessel if something goes wrong in demonstration. But as it gets more commercial, that would be stepping away from that to going to automating all processes on board to keep seafarers and people safe ashore.
Okay, thanks. And Britt and then Tony, from an insurance and a class point of view, any thoughts on this one?
Yes, if I go first, when we thought about who was going to be on a vessel, a MAV, we recognised that we might be in a transition phase, and I was just looking at the definition in our policy of crew, and it's very wide actually. We say it means a person employed or engaged in any capacity on board a MAV on the business of that MAV, or any person engaged in the direct control and operation from a remote location whilst at that location. So we're kind of envisaging that there may be people on board the actual mass at the time. This is something that we would be asking about at the point of entry of such a mass into our club. It's not an unusual risk for us in the terms of traditional risks. We quite often have surveyors or third parties on board our vessel, and they would be covered as well in the normal traditional way. So yeah, it's a good question.
Tony?
I would say from our position in the sector is everything needs to be properly looked at and the case made. I would at high level suggest that the easiest, either end of the spectrum's slightly more straightforward. It's either full autonomous, no one's on it, or it's fully manned, obviously, and therefore that. So when you talk about a hybrid, and you could, for want of a language, talk about the equivalence of human cargo, if they have no skill set, that becomes a more challenging environment. If it's a support vessel, supply vessel, potentially going to an offshore wind farm, and someone's trained to a minimum level, when there's a system failure, that person steps up and does a manned role. That is a lot simpler to consider and generate evidence around than it is someone who has no skill in amongst it. And therefore, so it's case by case and the business model that goes with it. Some elements I think will work and be, I won't call it simple, but applicable and can be met or will be able to be met. Others will be more of a challenge to do so.
Okay, I'm going to shift the subject. Phil Buckley has asked about the decarbonisation debate, which he suggests has an element of it's easy for short sea shipping, but less likely for long and slow deep sea trade. Is there the same separation in autonomy, or he suggests, can we simply scale up Zulu Associates' ideas? Anthony, I think I better ask you that one. Antoon van Coillie, that is, please.
Well, we are concentrating obviously on short sea because we're also looking at inland waterways, and the systems are very similar. A short sea vessel or an inland waterway vessel, obviously the inland waterway has not the same, totally same environment, but the communication systems and all that are the same. Going across the ocean, we are not involved in that because I think that's going to be far more complicated. On the other hand, there are some communication systems available for, I mean, SeaKit is doing it as well. And, you know, if you're in the middle of the ocean, you have to be able to move, you know, you can have your error because there are the problems you face are much further away. So the lead time in order to do something can be longer. But I think it's a different kettle of fish, and it will need different technologies, or at least adapted technologies. I don't think all that we can do on short sea will be able to be used on longer voyages. And one of the main points is also in short sea and in waterways, as we do fairly short distances, the maintenance problem on board a ship is much less. In other words, you can have the ship run for 48 hours without doing any maintenance. But if you run for, let's say, a 10-day trip, I think that's a different system again. And that's going to be far more challenging than what we want to do. So it's totally different, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, I'm very sad that Quangle Lee isn't actually online, but he's probably tucked up because it's the middle of the night in Korea. But there was a question that's been asked. Is the panel jealous from the presentation that Quangle gave us of Korea's evidently coherent approach to autonomy? Will we in the UK or Europe ever manage to patch up our fragmented approach to regulation and innovation for ports and shipping? Wow, that's an interesting question, and I'm not quite sure where to land it, to be honest. But who hasn't had a go? Well, Neil, what's your view on that?
To be honest, James, I don't think I'm the best person versed at the regulatory side of this. I think there is. It would be nice to have a more tied-up approach. We've had several discussions with different people in different ports, and we know the challenges of getting approval from different areas, and that's encouraging us to work out of certain locations. But with regards to, are we ever going to be able to do it? I'll push it back to you. You're probably better versed in this than I am.
Yeah, it's a question of being joined up. Let's go to the defence world, and Anthony Crabb, and then Mike, would you have a view on this from the defence sector?
I mean, I think, like all, we would like to have one set of coherent policy that we're following, but I'm not best placed to make a comment on who should be leading that. We work for the Defence Maritime Regulator and to their tune, and how they interact with the broader UK and policy, that's for them.
206 time, eh? Okay, Mike, from the defence industrial sector, what's your view on this coherence? And I wouldn't highlight regulation particularly, but on the innovation side, are we sharing enough information, and what are we really that bad? I'm not sure we are, but what's your view?
No, I don't think we're terrible at all. I think it's easy to spotlight things that other nations are doing particularly well, and I think that's really helpful. They've got different agendas, and you can often capture your imagination and say, well, actually, that's pretty good. We should be doing a bit more of that, as well as what we're doing. I think we've got quite a good ecosystem around the technology side in the UK. I think we were one of the early adopters in terms of trying to develop some of the technical solutions. Are others at risk of overtaking us? Maybe. I think that's possibly the risk, that we are still quite a small nation. I'm not sure that our government has quite woken up to the opportunities that this presents in the same way as they have for example, the automotive sector. Could they be putting a lot more investment and focus around it to transform that position? Don't get me started on Brexit. Yes, they definitely could. Would that have been a worthwhile thing? Yes, because if you look back in history, had we been a trailer in the maritime industry a number of 100 years ago, we wouldn't have had a British Empire. Now, don't want to get back to imperial times, but actually, it's a long, hard slide. You've got to invest. You've got to be coordinated to be successful as a world player. And are other nations going to eat our breakfast? Yes, possibly, if we don't step up our game even further than we have so far.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to change the subject. Alice Kennard has asked a question which has been touched on in some way obliquely, but her question is, current deck navigation officers have limited technological training. So the question really is about what skills and training may they require to become future-proof and translate their skills to a remote operator role. And do you envisage this being implemented through SDCW or being company specific? Stuart, can I go to you for a thought on this? I know Talis has given it a lot of thought.
Yeah, and this is a great question. I must apologise. I'm probably not the person to speak to. I mean, I think we mentioned briefly earlier about the change in skill sets that they're going to need to be for the people operating these systems. And certainly the move from having people on board vessels to remote is as much I think probably a change in mindset as anything. We have to ensure that it doesn't become too easy for them to lose, if you like, ownership of what's happening out at sea and with the platform. So the need to ensure that they have what we might call situational awareness in the true sense of the word, so they really understand what's happening out on the platform. And I mentioned some UAV crashes and the Accident Investigation Branch reports on those, and those are interesting to read, because some of the topics they raise around the decisions being made on the basis of what the operator thought was happening but wasn't actually happening are very important. So when we do move to these remote control centres, remote operation centres, then it's making sure that those people are not just technically skilled, but we have the overarching processes and framework in place to ensure that they are supported, they're not asked to make decisions, that they are not in a position to do so. So I hope that helps. Apologies, I'm not too experienced in terms of the training requirements and STCW.
Okay, thanks very much, Stuart. If I may just offer one view from the MAS Red Group point of view, STCW is absolutely at the heart of what we've been saying, that the skill sets will need to be centred around for anyone involved in MAS operations, specifically in RCCs. So I don't see it being company specific. I do see it being STCW. But Ben Murray, I'm sorry you're still having problems seeing the questions, but do you have a view from Maritime UK on this?
Great, thanks, James. Yeah, I just wanted to, not necessarily on the substance, but just it's a nod to that previous question about fragmentation, which I'll come to just afterwards if I may. But just one specific point for colleagues that might not be aware, and this might seem a bit parochial in the sense that it's a UK initiative, but we certainly want to engage and share and learn and work with others around the world, because this is clearly an issue that we're all moving forward and trying to respond to together. But just last year, jointly Maritime UK and the Department for Transport established a Maritime Skills Commission, which we all sit in meetings, I imagine, where people profess a skills gap or skills shortage or here and there, and often when the response is, well, what's the evidence for that? Where's the data? The argument falls away a little bit. So the point of the Commission is to get to the heart of the real issues around what both the certain parts of the country might need in terms of skills, different parts of the sector, and what might be required in the future. And one of its, and the Commission is comprised of people, representatives and colleagues of many on this call, but others too, that are from across all parts of the sector. So that's the shipping industry, the technology, the science, the leisure side, the ports, the business services, and so on. And what they are doing are assessing not only the lay of the land today, but also looking at some specific projects. And they are around, there's a seafarer cadet review going at the moment, there's a future ports workforce piece, there's a piece on maritime education and training and how we can look at that as a commodity, as an export. There's others, and this is all on the Maritime UK website, but there's also one on automation, and that hasn't started yet. Just in terms of bandwidth, we've prioritised that for 2021. And I think clearly, whether it's I know the MASREG has done a lot in this space, but there's others on this call that will have plenty to contribute. And I think there's the point of flagging that is that this commission does have this topic on the agenda, and we want people to be feeding into that. There'll be an evidence gathering section later this year. So that was one point. And then on the previous question around fragmentation, I mean, I feel that one sits at our front door a little bit. It's our job has been to bring some coherence and coordination to those issues that cut across the sector. And I think we've been doing this probably 4.5 years now as Maritime UK, and I think there's areas where that's really worked well. I think in some of the programs and initiatives and priorities we have, that's working really well. I think there's areas that we can do better. I think on innovation, I think reflecting some of the comments from other panelists, I don't think it's a disaster story. I think people, trying to coordinate and bring people to work together requires people to want to do that, and it's a slow burn in some areas, and we've seen that on some technologies and with some parts of the country and some different types of businesses happen quicker than in other areas. But if you look at things, I know it might not be relevant to this, but if you look at what Mary UK is doing, and gradually that's membership ticking up, if you're looking at what each of the regions are doing in consortia, Strengthen Places bid, funding in Northern Ireland, funding hopefully soon in the Southwest and other places. I think there's a good direction of travel, but it requires people to get used to, and all of us to get used to that more collaborative and collegiate working. And then the final point is, I think as Brits, we can all do better. Sorry, Brit. As British people, we can all do better at actually talking ourselves up. I think that's not to say we shouldn't get the substance right, but actually things are getting better, things are improving, and being a bit more positive about some of the things that are actually just makes us all feel better and helps encourage us to keep doing what we're doing and to step that up. So just a few reflections there, mainly to flag various initiatives and activities, and as ever, check the website out. There's plenty of opportunities to get involved with, be it our technology and innovation working group, which is being rejuvenated, or some of those regional Strengthen Places bids in particular. That's going to be a bigger and bigger focus of this government in particular, and I think it's starting to work. Is my final point. If you look at the back end of last year, there was a week in November where the government announced not only that maritime was on par with aviation in terms of being part of its plans for decarbonising the economy. There was also the free ports policy, which has been significantly shaped and enhanced by engagement through ourselves, our members and companies, and is an important tool. And then also the support for the Navy in terms of particularly the technology and the equipment and the systems that are going in there. And I think it's about the responsibility we have to utilise that growing recognition and platform to help accelerate not just this area of activity and technology, but all other parts that we have. And it's a broad area, but I think it's a positive journey that we're on. Thanks, James.
Sorry, James. Can I just jump in with just going back to the original sort of question? We sort of moved on a little bit, so if anyone can remember, it goes back to some of the sort of points I was raising a little bit. If we have a fully autonomous vessel, that's quite easy to bound. If you have a fully remote vessel, that's fairly easy to bound. If you have a remote control vessel with some autonomous systems, that's again a little bit harder, but fairly easy to bound. If you have the hybrid where a subsystem flits between autonomous and remote, it's where's that handshake? How do we secure that handshake happens? And some of the audience, I'm sure, are looking at navigation assist sort of tools that will go onto a bridge, a manned bridge. If you watch that 20 times and get confidence, it makes a certain decision. Where's that handshake? Where do you know I'm leaving it to the system, or I am as the human in the loop, sort of responsible for it? And it can be it's the trust and the potential confidence, lack of confidence and overconfidence. It's just setting those boundaries and making sure that the appropriate handshakes happen, and that's assessed to be happening is a critical in the approach in the hybrid sort of deliverables.
Okay, Tony, thanks very much. I always reverse the principle here, and I'm on the bridge of a ship, fully manned, normal, conventional type thing. You know, when I look out with my binoculars, I don't actually ask the question, oh, I wonder if there's anyone on board, or whether the, what propulsion system they've got. What I do is to assume that they will obey the call regs and do what they have to. Sometimes I think we perhaps not overthink this, but we've got to accept that there are designs that I'm sure a lot of you have seen or are aware of, where a vessel may actually sail transatlantic, transoceanic, with perhaps a master and one deck officer, and they will flip in one journey between all sorts of levels of control and autonomy. So, this is something we're all going to be, I'm sure, watching quite closely. I'm going to just finish with the panel with a specific question that has been asked about equivalence. Equivalence for the automation of particular functions or tasks seems rather straightforward, says Sifis. I wish. However, how do you establish equivalence for entire systems that may be compared to different transport modes? What about individual or societal risk acceptance criteria in combination with the ALARC principle? And this is particularly relevant when you look at the terrible media coverage of one particular incident in the US with a car, and the often debated, what do you do? Do you avoid the two people on the pavement or whatever? If I can go around the whole panel on this one, this is equivalence, which in many ways lies at the absolute heart of the success of any form of autonomy in the maritime sphere. Mike, could you kick that one off, please?
Oh, I was hoping you weren't going to start with me. That's quite a difficult question, isn't it? So, I mean, just picking up on your example, I guess, on the automotive world, I know there was a whole load of work in a study in the automotive world in Bristol, looking at exactly those societal issues. One of the interesting things they found was that people are more likely to step out in front of an unmanned, a driverless car than they are a driver one, because they think the computer will obey its rules and stop, whereas a person may not notice them. Now, those of us that understand the technology probably horrified by that, but that was the layman's view. When things in a maritime context go well, equivalency is quite easy. So most of the time, you can get things to behave fairly sensibly and everything's okay. It's when the unexpected happens that people are much more adaptable than systems who've never seen that circumstance before. And we've seen, again, in the automotive industry, lots of examples. So there was the Tesla car that killed someone by failing to recognise a van in front of it. And although I don't know the details of that, I think it was effectively a sensor dazzle type problem. And it's actually quite difficult. If you ask a person, why did you have that accident? It's sometimes very difficult for them to articulate why it happened. It might have been I genuinely didn't see them because they were dressed in black and it was dark. And other responses might be, I don't know, I panicked. So yeah, really difficult. I failed to answer it. You can ask someone else.
James, can I step in for a moment? I was very interested actually in the last comment of its equivalence is fine until an unexpected event happens. And obviously I have the experience of seeing lots of claims and what actually has caused a claim, and it's generally not one thing. It's generally a whole host of circumstances that have come together in a perfect storm almost. And I did mention, I think, in my presentation that I agree, people are more adaptable, I think, and in a risk context, crew do sometimes mitigate or avoid risks, and it's kind of finding out a little bit more about that that's interesting. How much avoidance is there by crew, and what would an autonomous system do in those circumstances? But I think, it goes to trust and taking a risk, and I think that we must have a bit of trust and take that risk until we get some time, and some experience under our belts to work that out.
James, if I may intersect, I mean, when I see a ship, how do I know the crew is competent? Why do I, think that this crew is competent? We all think they've been to the right schools and blah, 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 that sort of stuff, but this may not be the case. I mean, accidents happen because people make mistakes and things like that. And, they may find themselves in a situation they don't know, and they do the wrong things because they haven't been trained for it, you say. Well, okay, they haven't been trained, but it's not because they have people on the ship that nothing will happen. And that's actually the same thing, I think. James,
You're on mute, James.
You're on mute, James.
Sorry about that. It was because I was sneezing. Let me go to the Navy and ask what the view from the naval sector on this is, because let's face it, you spend a lot of time looking inwards when incidents and accidents happen. Anthony Crabb, do you have a view on it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the single systems or the smaller bits, maybe we will arrive at a moment where we are willing to describe an equivalence. Although the point about mitigation in crews, I mean, it's happening all the time, and we're doing it. But on the entire systems, I don't think we're ever going to establish equivalence. When we start employing autonomy as a means of delivering an effect in the warfighting scenario, we're not going to hand that across to that decision making, whether that's under a rule of engagement for lethal force or even non-lethal force. I don't think we are ever going to get into that space, at least not in the short time frame. Over.
Yeah, okay, over. Okay, thanks. Tony Boylen, a quick thought from you?
Yeah, I go back a little bit to the 99.99% sort of slide I had. In very simplistic, and because it's such a complex task, is everything has a factor on each other. So you have the sensor, the autonomy engine, the environment, and you can go on and add multiple factoring. Each take the performance level down. If we look at Anthony's example of his two capability areas, let's make the assumption that the inwards one is absolutely fantastic in every measurable way, perfect. But when you then take it out into the open waters, does that autonomy engine still take the right primacy from a sensor? Is that sensor the right sensor? If you change one of the sensors and upgrade, for instance, the camera to more focal lens, does that still work with the autonomy engine? There's so many moving pieces that you have to look. So I almost say that it's everything has to be looked at commonly, uniquely. You have to look at it, and everyone's approach is subtly different and stuff like that. We need to come up with metrics to try and bound it, but even with that, we're only bringing it down onto hopefully one page rather than the whole textbook. But we cannot, I think, ever bring everyone to one line. So it's just, there's always going to have to be that flexibility, agility, but it's a complex beast.
Thanks. Neil, I was going to ask you the question, but I think you've got to dash away, but thank you very much as you go. Stuart, do you have any thoughts before we wrap it up?
Yeah, no, I'll be brief because my son needs his laptop back to join the lesson. No, I think it is one of those it is one of those really hard, probably impossible to answer questions, and a bit of I suppose a bit of an advert for the MAS RWG, because it is a multidisciplinary question. It is something that needs input from technology, engineering, the government, regulators, human factors, legal. So it is a really big question. It can only be, I'm not going to say it's going to be answered, but can only be addressed by working across multiple areas.
Okay. And Ben Murray, do you have a thought finally? Ben, are you with us? No, it's disappeared. I can see him there, but I can't hear him. Ben, are you on mute? That well-known expression. Part of every Christmas joke I ever heard. Okay. Look, I'm going to draw this session to a close. We've had some really interesting questions, which I hope some of you will have seen. We haven't addressed them all, but we've talked about class societies, and Sean asked the question about vessels and ships and so on and so on. We didn't specifically go into the business about, do people think that with less people on board, you reduce the insurance risk and cost? I actually think Britt covered that in her presentation. We talked about career. We talked about people reference maintenance and the requirements. We've touched on decarbonisation. Didn't really go into the technical detail of energy storage, but that's an interesting one. Lero Lindborg asked for Antoon about the auto ship program. May I suggest you get in touch directly, and your question can be answered there. We talked about the people who might be there not as sort of bridge people, and so on and so on, and I go down the list. The one area, and Rich King, if you're listening, I apologise, I didn't go into the switch over between the air certification world and the maritime one. It's a fascinating subject that you and I have discussed in the past, and if you want to engage, ping me an email and we'll pick it up and run with it. The time has come to close the show, really. As I do, and I'm certainly not going to try and draw the whole thing into a conclusion. So many speakers have given us such great food for thought, and the only thing I can do is reflect on the fact that 6 years on of conferences, it fascinates me that we're in such a completely different realm of what we're discussing, the practical applications, the reality of what's going on, point made earlier by various people. And for today's group of speakers, all of you, I'm incredibly grateful to you for giving it your time and for the massive contribution that you've made. So thank you all. There are a couple of other thank yous I want to make. One is to Dan Nichols, who you will have seen on a variety of emails. Dan took over the secretarial duties of the MAS Reg Group at the end of last year from Chloe, who I believe may still be online. I'm not absolutely sure. Good luck to you, Chloe, if you're listening, but well done for being promoted. And Dan, from all of us, and you know, we are talking about over 300 people who've been involved in this. Thank you for all the very hard work that you've done. I can't see you right now. I can see a picture of you sitting there, but nothing more. And finally, I am particularly grateful to the support that I've had from VCM and Oxgility. It's not easy putting a conference like this together, and we did quite a lot of research into how to do it, to make sure that we got the best arrangement and organisation. And Amanda, I hope you're there. Amanda has been the producer of this conference for the last 2 days. This was not the plan, I should say, because Michaela Thompson, who a lot of you will have seen on emails, sadly is trying to recover from COVID itself. And indeed, Amanda has had it recently. And so, Amanda, I hope you're there listening to me. Thank you very, very much for making this such a success from the production point of view. And you made all the difference. My last thank you, looking at the screen, is to say that we've had phenomenal support from our sponsors, BMT, Lloyd's Register, Thales, and BAE Systems, and the great support that we've had throughout from the team at Maritime UK. Thank you, and to the UK Chamber of Shipping. There remains very little for me to say in conclusion, except to say that I'd love to think that if we're back again in a year's time, we might all be together in one room somewhere. I think we're all at the point where we're missing that personal interaction, but the mere fact that we can sit together for 2 days talking about all these topics, perhaps meeting some new people or hearing new faces who you can pick up with. A number of people have asked about the presentations. They are going to be uplifted. Yesterday's are already on this conference Teams site, and today's will be uplifted as soon as I shut up. And we will be moving everything onto the Maritime UK site. This site will be open for 7 days, although you may not want to log back in and check it out yourselves. So from me, as the chair of the group, it's another year over. Do look at version 4 of the code, which you can find, And if you have any queries or any thoughts, any feedback, other than the fact that you can't make iPads work, I'd be delighted to hear from you. So to one and all, that's it. And thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
James, I would like to say bravo Zulu. Well done. Very nice.
Oh, bravo Zulu, that well-known naval expression. Thanks, Anthony.
Cheers.
Take care. All right.
Bye-bye.
Amanda, are you there?
Yes, I am.